Welcome to Curious Haunts. I'm your host, Jeremy Haun. When I was a kid, I was afraid of, well, everything. I was afraid of things in the dark, monsters under my bed, really afraid of the VHS box covers to the horror movies at the local video store. Most of all, I was afraid of the closet in the back of my room at my grandparents' house that we couldn't quite ever get closed. I was afraid of everything, but I was also curious. At around 12 years old, I decided to not be afraid anymore. I went to the local video store and rented every single horror movie in that section, A to Z. I saw lots of stuff I probably shouldn't have for 12 years old. And sure, I got some side eye from the guy behind the counter. I was a latchkey kid. We kind of just got to do things like that back then. But the thing is, I started to like it all. The more I watched and read, I realized that the monsters were cool. I also realized that the things I was imagining in my head were almost always 1,000 times scarier than any ghost, monster, or chainsaw-wielding maniac. Along the way, I turned a love of weird, spooky stories into a job, writing and drawing comic books. For 25 years, I've written and drawn for every major company out there. I worked on everything from Batman to Captain America and Iron Man and more. While I've loved telling stories about superheroes and all of that, my favorite stories have always been those weird, spooky ones. Over the past few years, I've been lucky enough to tell more and more of those kinds of horror comic book stories. And while I've always watched and read a lot of horror and explored strange and interesting places, I've had even more of an excuse to do so lately. It's research, after all. Let's be real. It's an excuse for me to do more of what I love, which led me to this, Curious Haunts. I want to share this continued deep dive into the weird, wonderful world of the spooky and strange with you. Here on Curious Haunts, I'm going to share my thoughts on books, movies, and oddities and ends that I'm enjoying. I'm also going to bring you along as I explore the stranger's side of things. Each episode, I'm going to share my travels, where I see everything from haunted hotels to horror-themed tiki bars, creepy abandoned theme parks to amazing oddity shops filled with obscure wonders. From time to time, I'll even sit down with some of my favorite people from the varied parts of the horror community and talk with them about our love of the darker side of things. So there you have it, Curious Haunts. Today on the show, I'm going to talk about a new special edition Blu-ray release that I'm really excited about. A gorgeous book that also happens to fit the theme of today's episode, and a look at a little cross-country trip to the location inspiration for one of my favorite all-time books and movies. But first, let's have a drink. And welcome to the Haunted Bar. One of the things I like almost as much as horror and strange things is a nice drink. So before I get going and talk about this week's features, I'm going to make a cocktail and set the mood. Since we're starting off, I wanted to show you how I make my signature old-fashioned. If we're out in a nice spot, I'm probably trying their version of the old-fashioned. If we're visiting my home bar and we're having a nice drink, this is the thing I'm going to make for you. As simple as the old-fashioned is, with some combination of whiskey, sugar in some form or another, and bitters, just about every version is a bit different. Some prefer a sugar cube. Others, like me, prefer simple syrup. Some muddle the fruit, some keep it simpler than that. Base liquors, those change too. This is how I do it. Because I'm a fan of controlling the level of sweetness throughout the cocktail, I start with simple syrup instead of some kind of sugar cube. What I'm using here is rich simple syrup made with a ratio of 2 parts sugar and 1 part liquid. The thing that I do that's just a little bit different is using 2 parts turbinado raw sugar and replacing the water with 1 part Virgil's root beer. I love the complexity that the combination of sugar and root beer brings to the drink. Why Virgil's? I tried a lot of different root beer options, and there's just an earthiness that I really liked about it. I build my old fashions in the glass. It's simple, easy, and well, saves on extra dishes. So I started building my old fashioned by taking my squeeze bottle and lightly coat the bottom of a rocks glass. If I had to guess, it's probably about a bar spoon and a half of the syrup. Balance here, that's important. You want the complex flavors of the simple syrup in there, but not too much. From there, we add bitters. Because I like a bold drink, I go with 4 dashes of Angostura bitters and 4 dashes of Regan's. Regan's is an orange bitters that I really love. After that, it's time for another secret weapon, saline solution. It just gives it a really nice pop. I use a 4-to-1 ratio for the solution. That's 4 parts water to 1 part salt. What I use is 3 drops there. I like to bottle the saline in these nice handy dandy little dropper bottles, easy to keep track of. Once I do that, I give the drink a nice little stir, and then I'm going to add my bourbon. There's always a lot of debate about which spirit makes the best old fashioned. I love a good rye. I love a Japanese whiskey. I've even made a lot of split spirit old fashions using equal parts of rye, bourbon, whatever I feel like. But my go-to for my old fashioned is Old Bardstown Estate Bourbon. It's 100 proof, which is a nice balance of everything else going on in this drink. I go with a really pretty big pour, 3 ounces here. There we go. Add it to the glass. And then after that, I'm going to give the drink another stir. Then I'm going to want to go in and add a nice big ice cube. That's going to give it a nice bit of dilution. Fancy, huh? Once I'm done with that, I take and cut a nice big swath of orange peel, rub it around the rim of my glass like that, and then for an extra bit of fun and flair, I take and light a match and express the oils over the old fashioned. I'm gonna rub it again, throw it in. And there you've got it. That's my signature old fashioned. So now that we have a nice little drink, let's head back to the auditorium and see what we've got for you today. I love physical media, always have. While I appreciate the idea, the convenience of digital media, I've always been a sucker for a special edition collection. Now, since we can't always rely on a movie or show being available on streaming, I feel a little extra validated by my ridiculously massive wall of DVDs and Blu-rays. We're also in a new golden age of special edition horror movie Blu-ray releases. Thanks to absolutely fantastic boutique Blu-ray distributors like Arrow Video, Severin Films, Vinegar Syndrome, and Scream Factory, we fans are getting beautifully restored, special feature-laden Blu-ray and 4K releases of everything from the new and popular to those obscure titles you've been searching for your whole life. Today I wanted to talk about a special edition release from another of my favorite boutique distributors, Umbrella Entertainment. Umbrella's been doing a lot of unbelievably cool special edition releases, like Talk to Me, The Black Death, and the Terrifier films. My favorite of them, though, is also one of my absolute favorite films of 2024, Late Night with the Devil. The second I saw the Night Owls Fan Club Collector's Edition pop up, I had to snag one. This gorgeous Blu-ray release comes with a TV Guide press kit, Conversations with the Devil, a 48-page look at the making of the film, art cards, a poster, and probably my favorite little element, a VHS containing the 1977 Night Owls original broadcast cut. I probably watch a half dozen horror movies a week. Some of them can be a lot of fun. The really, really good ones, the ones that surprise me, they're rare. Late Night with the Devil was one of those films. Directors Cameron and Colin Cairns, along with David Dastmalchian, and the entire cast and crew took a simple concept and setting and made something really special. If you haven't seen Late Night with the Devil, I can't recommend it more. If you're like me and love physical media, there are several editions of the film available on Blu-ray. My favorite of them being the Night Owls Fan Club Collector's Edition that should be available from Umbrella Entertainment. One thing I want to note about some of these releases, including this one from Umbrella Entertainment and other boutique distributors, is that they're often made for Region B players. Region B is Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Australia, and New Zealand. Before you order things, please do yourself a favor and check which region it's available in, and make sure your Blu-ray player is compatible with Region B. I don't want anybody being disappointed when they can't play a cool special edition they've paid their hard-earned money for. One easy trick is that the newest Xbox Series X and S can play Region B Blu-rays. That's how I watch them. And if you're, not into physical media so much, that's okay too. As of this recording, Late Night with the Devil is streaming on Shudder and Hulu. I love horror movies, but just as much, I love horror comics and books of all kinds. Today I wanted to talk about a perfect companion to our haunted travel segment, this stunning 2-volume slipcase edition book, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. This perfect book was conceived of and edited by Shining historian Lee Unkrich, written by J.W. Rensler, and published by one of my absolute favorite houses, Taschen Books. I've been poring over this thing. More than once, I sat down, opened one of the volumes, and pretty much lost time. I look up, and it's an hour later. It's that good. Every single detail's in there. The collection features 2 volumes. The Making of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, what I've found myself calling the Red Rum Bible, and the Scrapbook. The Red Rum Bible is an in-depth look at the making of Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, gathered from hundreds of hours of interviews with the cast and crew. There are accounts of everything from Kubrick's unrelenting, obsessive vision to the fire at Elstree Studios, along with photos and ephemera from the production. The Scrapbook is a beautiful collection of production photos from Stanley Kubrick's archive. I've always loved seeing behind-the-scenes moments of productions, especially one like The Shining. I'm glad I managed to get my hands on the collection. Now, like all of Taschen's books, it's a bit pricey, but The Shining's been on my mind a lot lately, so I had to get it. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is available to order now from Taschen Books. So, The Shining. I saw The Shining for the first time on the night of May 16, 1985. I was 10 years old. I remember the date specifically because my brother Eric and I were staying over at our parents' friends, Frank and Suzanne's house. My mom had gone into labor with my youngest brother William just after school that day. So while my parents headed off to the hospital, I sat alone, absolutely riveted on the orange shag carpet of the den in this mid-century house in Joplin, Missouri, and watched The Shining on HBO. I had no idea what everybody else was doing. It was just me, alone, with one of the most terrifying movies of all time. Needless to say, I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear Danny Torrance's weird little voice in my head saying, "Red rum, red rum." And I'd look over at the door to see if the words would be written there in lipstick or blood. In a lot of ways, The Shining was the beginning of my horror journey. It was a cornerstone that Curious Haunts and all of the work I've done since has been built upon. When I started thinking about Curious Haunts, I made a list of things that I love. Horror, everything about the genre. Good food, drinks, odd things. I've always loved cabinets of curiosity, creepy objects, and strange bits of ephemera. The last thing on that list, that was exploration. I don't care if it's walking through an old building or traveling to a different country. I just love exploring things. The list of things that I love led me to Curious Haunts. A friend asked me to describe what I was planning to do for the project. I knew I wanted to talk about the horror things that I love, and it wasn't until I talked about the exploration part where everything came together. I said something to the effect of, I want to be an admittedly less cool version of Anthony Bourdain, exploring weird, spooky, haunted places and things, while still having good food and drinks. And that clicked for me. Now, as I mentioned, every episode, I'm going to do a segment where I visit a spooky place or series of places that inspire me. Because The Shining was such a starting point for my horror journey, it only felt right to kick things off with The Shining Excursion. Okay, admittedly, I probably should have started this little project with something a little closer to home. But if you know me, you know I don't really do much of anything the easy way. And why not kick things off with a bang? The plan was simple. I'd visit the 2 real-life hotels that inspired and were featured in The Shining. I'd start off at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, and then hop a train, traveling all the way to the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood in Oregon. I flew from my home in southwest Missouri to Denver, Colorado. It's just a short flight, and before I knew it, I was in the Mile High City. I got in fairly late and stayed near the airport, since I needed to catch a shuttle there the next day. Estes Park and the Stanley Hotel are about an hour and a half from Denver. There are a few ways to get to the Stanley, but since I was taking this trip in early December, and the famous snowstorm in The Shining takes place right around the same time, I decided to take the Estes Park shuttle to the hotel. The Stanley Hotel opened its doors on July 4th, 1909. It was built by Freeland Oscar Stanley, who moved to the area during his third bout of tuberculosis. The original 48-room hotel was built as a health retreat for Stanley's wealthy socialite friends. The hotel lived many lives before it brought Stephen King, and eventually me, to its doors. Over the years, maybe at least a little due to the Stanleys' connection to The Shining, the hotel has gained more than a bit of haunted history. Okay, so I have to admit that I tried to book room 217, the Stephen King suite, but the room is notoriously booked up. While I was sad about that, this was the Shining expedition after all. The wonderful folks at the Stanley suggested their most famously haunted room, the Cowboy Attic, and I just couldn't resist. I checked in and found myself in room 428, ready for a few days of the spooky, strange, and whatever came my way. So wait, let's go back. We're at the Stanley Hotel, which is the hotel from The Shining, right? Yes. Okay, well, mostly. So one night in 1974, Stephen and Tabitha King found themselves at the Stanley Hotel. They pulled up in their family station wagon on the way to Boulder to find out that the hotel was actually closing down that very night for the winter season. It was getting late and the roads were bad, so with a bit of cajoling, King convinced the hotel staff to let them stay. Luckily, as it happens, there was just one room that was still set up, the presidential suite, room 217. As usual, King had been working on an idea for a story that took full form that one night at the Stanley, a story that would become The Shining. That night, Stephen and Tabitha King sat alone in the grand dining room, eating dinner. They sat there together in the eerie expanse, looking at all the other tables with their chairs neatly stacked on top, while strange canned orchestral music played somewhere down the hall. After dinner, Tabitha headed to bed, and Stephen found himself wandering the halls of the deserted hotel, more and more of the story taking shape in his mind. At some point, as the evening got later and later, King wandered past the bar, only to find it completely empty, not a bottle on the shelves. It's there that Stephen King met the inspiration for one of his most haunting characters, the actual caretaker of the Stanley Hotel, Lloyd Grady. In spite of the lack of a stocked bar, Grady produced a bottle of his own and offered to share a drink or two with a thirsty rider. King, being a stand-up guy, pulled a 20 out of his wallet and slid it over to Lloyd, at which point the caretaker said the one line that has made it through every iteration of the story of The Shining: "Your money is no good here." So the caretaker and the writer stayed up late into the night, drinking and sharing stories about the sordid, creepy history of the Stanley Hotel. Eventually, when the drinking was all done, King made his way back to room 217 and fell asleep. Somewhere in those early morning hours, King woke with a start to the sound of his son Joe screaming from the hall. He jumped out of bed, threw open the door to room 217 to find his oldest son being chased by one of the old-fashioned emergency fire hoses that ran throughout the hotel. The hose coiled like a snake and wrapped itself around the young boy. King watched helplessly, frozen in place, as his son Joe screamed and screamed. And just like that, screaming himself, covered in sweat, Stephen King woke up from one of the most terrifying nightmares of his life. The next morning, Stephen and Tabitha King left the Stanley Hotel, and not long after, The Shining was born. Almost exactly 50 years after the King's stay at the Stanley, I found myself wandering those same halls. As much as I would have loved to have the hotel to myself, today the Stanley is open year-round, and even in the off-season is a popular destination for lovers of everything from the haunted hotel experiences and The Shining to the gorgeous mountain scenery and all that comes with it. I spent the first day just exploring the hotel. I wandered the halls, and much like King, found myself in the hotel bar. Unlike King's trip, half a century ago, the bar was fully stocked. People were enjoying lunch and midday drinks, and much to my disappointment, Lloyd Grady was not behind the bar. While I'm sure the hotel has probably had a half dozen remodels over the years, I picked the spot that I imagined King and Grady sat and ordered myself lunch and a drink. The bison burger was tasty, and the old-fashioned, which is my absolute favorite drink, wasn't bad. I enjoyed chatting with the staff, met a few locals, and had a great time. With my belly full, I braved the howling December Colorado winds and decided to go for a walk around the grounds. Estes Park, Colorado sits at an elevation of 7,522 feet. That's just under 1.5 miles above sea level, a full half-mile higher than Denver, the mile-high city. I like to think I'm tough enough. I'm in decent shape. I regularly go for walks and have been known to partake in the occasional salad. Elevation, though, it kicks my ass. Whether it's Santa Fe, New Mexico, or the heights of Colorado, the elevation leaves me feeling as bad as any hangover I've ever had. Also, while places like Estes Park are spots where the best athletes come to train, I'm no athlete. Needless to say, I bravely huffed and puffed my way around the grounds of the Stanley, excited to see the hedge maze, made famous by The Shining. But, as much as I hate to say it, the Stanley's hedge maze left something to be desired. As cool and terrifying as the hedge maze from Kubrick's The Shining was, the maze itself replaced a group of giant, sentient topiary animals in King's novel. There wasn't actually a hedge maze at the Stanley. Not at the Timberline either, but that's a story for later. With the popularity of The Shining, the current ownership at the Stanley fully embraced it. The hotel started getting asked where the hedge maze was quite a lot. And since they're embracing it all, they planted one. Now, in spite of, up until that point, not having a hedge maze or giant topiary animals, one thing that Estes Park and the Stanley have a lot of is elk. They're everywhere. I guess they also thought that the first hedge maze was delicious. So after getting it planted and going, elk rolled in and ate the whole thing. What you're seeing here is a complete reattempt at the hedge maze, and according to the nice folks at the hotel, is made of something that isn't quite as tasty to the roaming elk. So while there isn't a lot to this second attempt at the Stanley Hotel hedge maze, we can't really hold it against them. That evening, I made my way back to the hotel bar for a quick bite to eat before the night's festivities. Since I'm a fan of peaty scotches, the bartender suggested I try a Cooleel Adelphi 12 from their fantastic selection of bottles. It was a nice, smoky little pour, exactly what I was wanting on a chilly, spooky night like this. As I mentioned, the Stanley Hotel has really leaned into its hauntingly inspiring past. They now offer several different tours and supernatural experiences, and since I'm here for it, I wanted to do as many as possible during my short stay. After dinner, my first nighttime tour was, of course, the Shining tour. For understandable reasons, you can't actually film a tour. And to be honest, the point of a tour is the experience. So while I don't have much to show from the Shining tour, I promise the trip through the history of Stephen King's stay and the origins of The Shining were well worth it. Famously, in spite of being arguably one of the best horror movies of all time, Stephen King wasn't a fan of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. While King based the Overlook Hotel in the book on the Stanley, what we saw in the 1980 film was shot on sound stages at Elstree Studios in England. And the famous exterior? We'll talk about that later. But it wasn't the look of The Shining that King didn't care for. It was the changes to the characters from the book, especially Wendy Torrance, and the major changes in Jack's character and ultimate end. Because of that, Stephen King returned to the Stanley in 1997 to produce an all-new ABC miniseries with his frequent collaborator, horror director Mick Garris. While the miniseries only aired once at ABC, it had a recent resurgence thanks to a special edition Blu-ray release from the fine folks at Shout Factory. At the end of the tour, before heading back to the Cowboy Attic, I got one extra special treat. A series of painstakingly beautiful recreations from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. While sure, those were sets and were only inspired by the book, inspired by the Stanley, there was something absolutely chilling standing in the exact replica of that famous bathroom in room 237. After the tour, I wandered the halls of the hotel just a bit before returning back to my room. I have to admit, there's something to walking those long halls at night. something inspiring. I made my way back to the Cowboy Attic, room 428, to do some writing of my own. I'm right in the middle of writing my own horror story. It's a comic book. Not about a haunted hotel, but definitely about a dark curse and horrible things just outside of our own perception. Maybe it was the altitude, the nice pour of scotch with dinner, or staying in one of the most haunted rooms in the hotel. But that night, things started to feel a little strange. I worked for a while. I don't know how long, but I typed and typed. In spite of my somewhat skeptical nature, I couldn't spend the night in such a famously haunted room without seeing if I could get some spectral occurrence on film. Just anything at all. Please? So I set up my trusty camera, put on my PJs, and hopped into bed, hoping to get just a glimpse at the cowboy ghost. It's been said that the spirit of Rocky Mountain Jim Nugent haunts room 428 of the Stanley Hotel. Reports of furniture moving and footsteps are common. The cowboy ghost also has been known to stand at the foot of the bed and watch over guests as they sleep. Rumor has it that on occasion, the cowboy ghost will come over and place a single cold, spectral kiss on the forehead of ladies as they sleep, especially ones wearing an extra frilly nightgown. Now, that is creepy. I woke up the next morning, and my usual tossing and turning aside remained unhaunted. No strange sounds in the night, no waking to spectral cowboys, no kiss on the forehead. Maybe I should have worn frillier pajamas. I made my way downstairs to do a bit more writing in the lobby. Looking over my work from the night before, I was a little worried about the effect the hotel was having on me. Pretty quickly, I hit a nice pace and managed to make my writing goal just in time for lunch. While I enjoyed my meals at the hotel bar, I heard the spot for lunch at the Stanley was the Post Chicken and Beer, located in the newly renovated Stanley Carriage House. Crispy fried chicken? Count me in. I bundled up and walked over to the Post. On my third day in Colorado, I was adjusting to the altitude, and the fresh air did me good. I got sat down, met the warm, friendly staff, and ordered their famous fried chicken and a side of charred broccolini. Since the sun was shining in and I was on an adventure, I went ahead and ordered myself the Post Old Fashioned. The combination of a cinnamon syrup and rosemary were spot on perfect, and it ended up being one of my favorite drinks of the trip. After lunch, I walked back to the hotel and visited the vault. I visited the Stanley looking for one kind of spirits and ended up finding a different kind altogether. The vault at the Stanley is an amazing collection of barrel picks and special bottles, curated specifically for the hotel. One of my only regrets about my visit to the Stanley is that their special whiskey tasting events are only held on the weekends. While I missed out on one of their tasting experiences, I got to walk through the tasting room, see their amazing selection, and even pick up a couple barrel pick bottles to take home with me. Later that evening, I attended the Stanley night tour. While I loved the Shining tour, the night tour was definitely the highlight of the trip. Our guide took the group through the dark corners and basements of the hotel grounds, shared stories about hauntings, and showed us a collection of supposedly authenticated photos of strange supernatural events. As I mentioned before, while I tend to be a bit skeptical, there were definitely a few moments standing there in darkened passageways lit only by a faint red or green glow that sent shivers down my spine. After the tour, a few of us stood around and talked about the various reports of hauntings at the hotel. I had the chance to meet the couple that were staying in room 217. While they had the coveted Stephen King suite, they admitted that they were just as jealous of my staying in the most haunted spot in the hotel. After everyone went their separate ways, I went for one last late-night walk around the hotel. I couldn't help but think about Stephen King wandering those same halls some 50 years before. I thought about the story it would create and the effect it would have on me and my own career in horror. That night, I went to bed. I said goodbye to the cowboy ghost and assured him that if he felt up to moving some furniture around or other spooky antics, I was absolutely game for it. But alas, I said goodbye to the Stanley Hotel early the next morning. I was grateful to the hotel and the staff, glad to have this be the starting point of my adventures with curious haunts. I hopped the Estes Park shuttle back to Denver. While I was sad to go, there were more things to see, and I couldn't wait. I arrived in downtown Denver just a couple hours later. The old haunted hotel hallways at the Stanley gave way to the new and modern at the Limelight Hotel, right next to Union Station. I'd be heading out on Amtrak early the next morning, and while the chances of a ghostly encounter were slim to none, it was the perfect spot for the night. With just one night in Denver, and so much that I wanted to see, the second I got to the room, I dropped off my luggage and made my way to Mile High Comics. When I was a kid, there was an ad for Mile High Comics in the back of pretty much every comic on the stands. It was a legendary place that had just about every comic a young kid could dream of. More than once, I saved up my allowance, threw it in an envelope with a list of comics I was looking for, and eagerly awaited their eventual arrival at my front door. Over the years, working in comics, I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of amazing shops. But even now, after all this time, getting to finally visit Mile High was pure magic for me. In spite of my limited luggage space, I couldn't help but pick up a few things before heading to my next stop. Now, I love oddity shops, and Denver has more than a few amazing ones. I barely made it to the Odditorium in time to do a little shopping before they closed for the evening. The Odditorium is one of two side-by-side shops specializing in the wonderful and strange. The shop is a perfect mix of vintage delights, fun replica items, and the oddest of the odd. Once again, thanks to my luggage limitations, I had to choose my purchases carefully. I thanked the staff for letting me stay a bit late, and then made my way back to the hotel to drop off my finds. I was meeting friends for dinner that evening, but had just enough time to drop by a fun little spot downtown for a drink along the way. Hell or High Water is my kind of joint, a horror-themed tiki bar that was decked out to the nines for the holidays. With a dinner reservation soon, I had just enough time for one drink, so I had to make it count. The clear choice was their take on the Jungle Bird, a drink called The Nonsensical Ravings of a Lunatic Mind. The drink comes in one of the coolest horror-themed tiki mugs I've seen in a while. The other, a Frankenstein bust mug from the folks at Tiki Farm. A drink this good in a tiki mug that rare comes with a catch. If you want the drink, you're going to have to give them your shoe as collateral. I really should have worn different boots. So I sat there drinking the aptly named Nonsensical Ravings of a Lunatic Mind, one socked foot out for the world to see. And you know what? It was absolutely worth it. After getting my shoe back and begrudgingly returning the tiki mug, I walked over to meet friends for dinner at the Linger Eatuary. Linger is a fantastic Asian fusion spot in the former Olinger Mortuary, famous for once housing the remains of Buffalo Bill Cody for 6 months. We enjoyed drinks, and while sampling items from the amazing menu, I smiled to myself, thinking that this vibrant, hip spot used to be the death capital of Denver. So we wrapped up dinner, and I headed back to the Limelight at a fairly reasonable hour. As much as I wanted to stay out, have more adventures, and find other spooky cool spots to drink the night away, I needed to be ready to pack up and head out early the next morning. Denver was lovely, and the morning would bring the next part of this strange adventure. My second destination on this shining expedition was the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood in Oregon. And what better way to get there than hopping aboard a cross-country Amtrak train? I boarded the California Zephyr at Union Station in Denver. The first leg of this train trip would take me to Sacramento, California, where I'd have a bit of a layover before boarding another train, the Coast Starlight, and heading north, all the way to Portland, Oregon. Since I'm getting old, and an entire trip in one of their admittedly nice regular seats is a bit much for me, I decided to get a roomette for this trip. It was a first for me. I've always just toughed it out. The nearly sleepless nights and backaches were just part of the adventure. But again, I'm old. As soon as I dropped my bags off in the roomette, we got the call for breakfast. There are a lot of little perks that come with upgrading to a room on the train. One of the best of those perks is getting to have 3 meals a day in the dining car. The food is good. Fairly simple choices, but miles better than anything you're going to have on a plane. After breakfast, I made my way back to the room, took advantage of the free coffee and water, looked out the window, and watched the country go by. So here's the thing about me. I love trains. They're easily my favorite way to travel. They're also, oddly, where I do some of my best work. There's just something about traveling across the country, looking out and seeing the amazing scenery that's absolutely inspiring to me. After I got settled, I pulled out my trusty laptop and started to write. It didn't take long for me to hit my groove. I needed to finish a script on this trip, and before long, I realized that was going to happen. Maybe even faster than I expected. I took breaks for lunch, walks to the observation car, and even a nice little nap. Outside my window, the train made its way from snow-covered plains to majestic mountains. By dinner time, I'd finished that script and felt great about it. I arrived back to my roomette after dinner to find the seats made up into a surprisingly cozy bed. I caught up on some reading, wrote in my journal, and before long found myself rocked to sleep by the gentle motion of the train. I woke early the next morning somewhere outside of Reno. After breakfast, and more coffee than is probably clinically responsible, I decided to start on the next script. It made me wonder if it might be possible to just live on a train. Around lunchtime, just a few hours outside of Sacramento, we got word that the snow was blocking the pass, and there would be a bit of a delay. As excited as I was to get to Sacramento, I took the extra time to plan out my evening in the city. Like my short time in Denver, I was going to have a plan and move quickly if I wanted to see everything. After about an hour on the pass, they cleared the snow, and we were able to move on. I arrived in Sacramento around 4 o'clock, ready to start the next leg of my adventure. But that'll have to wait until next time. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of the Shining Excursion. It was an absolutely amazing time, and a hell of a way to kick off Curious Haunts. Part 1? That's right. How did the rest of this weird little adventure go? You'll just have to come back next episode and find out. So as you've seen, one of my favorite things to do is walk through antique malls and oddity shops and find things that just speak to me. Recently, after I got back from my little Shining excursion, I was walking through a local antique mall. Okay, it was more of a flea market. But as I looked down, I saw this amazing rogue mallet. In Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, Jack Torrance terrorized poor Wendy and Danny, and worst of all, Dick Halloran with a fire axe. But in Stephen King's book, a much more conflicted Jack used an oversized rogue mallet to do the job. Rogue is basically croquet, and a rogue mallet is just a bigger, meaner, definitely something you wouldn't want to get hit with. Maybe having The Shining on my mind, rereading the book, going on the excursion to the Stanley and the Timberline, and getting the Taschen books put me in the right place to see this mallet lying there. I like to think that it was just waiting for me, waiting to join my collection. So that's it for the first episode of Curious Haunts. If you have a weird, wonderful, spooky place that you feel like I should visit, please let me know. And if you'd like to join me on this curious and haunting journey, please like, follow, and subscribe. And if you know a fellow traveler who, like you, is drawn to the strange and unusual, I'd appreciate you sharing Curious Haunts with them. I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Cheers.